Family, I came here today with urgency because the Sabbath is not just a day, it's a seal, a sign, a test, and a weapon of power. Too many of God's people are treating the Sabbath like an appointment on the calendar when in truth, it's the heartbeat of heaven's covenant. Ellen White, though often misquoted or misunderstood, left behind Sabbath truths that many Adventists have set aside, and if we keep ignoring them, we risk missing the very preparation God designed. Let me show you the 7 Sabbath secrets most have ignored. The Sabbath is about rest, not rule. The Sabbath was never meant to be a burden, a checklist, or a rigid set of restrictions. It was designed to be a blessing, a divine pause, a holy reset for the human soul. Too often people have taken the beauty of the Sabbath and turned it into a system of rules, stripping it of the joy and freedom that God intended. Ellen White made it clear, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That means God gave it to us as a gift, not as a prison. When Jesus walked the dusty roads of Galilee, he faced constant criticism from the religious leaders who had turned the Sabbath into an endless list of regulations. They accused him of breaking the Sabbath when he healed the sick, when he allowed his disciples to pluck grain, when he restored life and hope on that sacred day. But in every act, Jesus showed that the Sabbath was about rest, restoration, and relationship, not rigid rule-keeping. Rest is more than lying down or doing nothing. Rest means releasing the burdens that weigh on your heart. It means stepping away from the endless grind of the world, the pursuit of money, status, and survival, and remembering that you are more than what you produce. On Sabbath, God calls you to remember that you are His child, not just another cog in society's machine. That rest is a protest against the world system. When you rest in Christ on Sabbath, you declare, I am not a slave to Pharaoh, to Babylon, or to Wall Street. I belong to God. This is why the Sabbath is more powerful than most people realize. It is spiritual resistance against the forces that want to keep you bound. Rules may restrain behavior, but rest restores the soul. Think about it. You can avoid shopping, working, or engaging in secular activities on Sabbath and still miss the true blessing if your spirit is restless, anxious, or bitter. God is not pleased with outward compliance while the heart remains unrenewed. The real test of Sabbath keeping is not whether you avoid doing, but whether you enter into being. Are you being renewed? Are you being filled with joy, gratitude, and peace? That is the kind of rest that the Sabbath brings. Ellen White wrote that the Sabbath was meant to be a day of communion with God and with one another, a time when heaven draws close to earth. But how often do people approach Sabbath with frowns instead of smiles, with fear instead of faith? Children grow up associating Sabbath with boredom instead of joy, because too many have emphasized what cannot be done instead of what God has invited us into. Yet God designed this day to be the most beautiful time of the week, a window into Eden, a foretaste of eternity. When you truly rest in Him, Sabbath becomes not just the end of a busy week, but the beginning of eternal fellowship with your Creator. The Pharisees made Sabbath a weight, but Jesus made it wings. He showed us that the day was not about endless prohibitions, but about liberating power. Every healing He performed on the Sabbath was a sermon in action. This day is about setting captives free, and if you truly understand that, you will no longer see the Sabbath as something to endure, but as something to embrace. It is a weekly declaration that in Christ, you are not bound by this world's chains. You are free, you are chosen, you are loved. So the next time you welcome the Sabbath, don't enter it with a checklist. Enter it with a heart ready to receive rest. Don't ask, what am I not allowed to do? Ask instead, how can I experience God's presence more deeply today? Because when you shift from rules to rest, the Sabbath will cease being a burden and become what God always intended it to be, a blessing beyond measure, a sanctuary in time, and a sign that you are His. The Sabbath is heaven's seal, not just a sign. The Sabbath has always been more than just a marker in time. It is more than a weekly pause, more than a tradition passed down through generations. The Sabbath is heaven's seal, the mark of divine ownership, stamped upon the heart and life of every believer who chooses loyalty to God above the systems of men. Ellen White emphasized this repeatedly. Yet many have reduced the Sabbath to nothing more than a sign of belonging to a denomination. But let me tell you today, it is not about being Adventist, Baptist, or any other label. The Sabbath seal is about belonging to the Lord of creation and redemption, the God who carved His law in stone and wrote His covenant in eternity. A sign can be ignored, counterfeited, or misplaced, but a seal carries authority. A seal is legal, binding, and final. Kings sealed decrees so that no man could change them. Nations sealed documents to confirm authenticity. Heaven itself uses the Sabbath as its seal to distinguish who belongs to God. While many talk about end-time prophecies and fear the mark of the beast, too few understand that the issue is not just about Sunday versus Sabbath. It is about allegiance. Whom will you obey when the world demands one thing and God commands another? The Sabbath is not an optional extra. It is the dividing line that reveals where your loyalty lies. Ellen White described the Sabbath as the seal of righteousness, the visible expression of inward faithfulness. It is not merely a day on the calendar, but an imprint on the character. When you honor the Sabbath, you declare that the Creator is your King, and that His authority overrides every earthly power. That's why the Sabbath will be the great test of loyalty in the last day. Not because of the day itself, but because of the authority it represents. Keeping the Sabbath is an act of submission to God's sovereignty, while rejecting it is aligning with the counterfeit system of the enemy. When you understand this, the Sabbath takes on a weight far deeper than tradition. It becomes the covenant mark that separates those who follow the Lamb wherever He goes from those who bow to convenience and compromise. It becomes the spiritual seal that God places upon the foreheads of His faithful, not as ink or branding, but as a settled conviction, a heart anchored in obedience and trust. The Sabbath is God's way of saying, "These are my people. They rest in me. They honor my word, and they cannot be bought or bribed by the world." Think about it. In Revelation, the angel ascends from the east, sealing the servants of God in their forehead. That seal is none other than God's law written in the heart, with the Sabbath as its centerpiece. Why? Because the Sabbath contains His name, His title, and His territory. It declares Him as the Creator of heaven, and it's the signature of God's covenant, the stamp of authenticity that says, "This soul belongs to me." When the counterfeit mark of the beast is enforced, only those who carry this seal will stand unmoved. Too many Adventists have treated the Sabbath as if it were a badge to wear rather than a bond to keep. They think attending church on the right day is enough, but the seal runs deeper. It is not about sitting in pews, but about living in obedience. It is not about the external act alone, but about the internal transformation. The Sabbath as a seal means your life has been surrendered to the authority of Christ, and that surrender shows itself every week when you choose God's will over your own. The seal of God cannot be faked. You cannot wear it like a uniform or claim it by association. It is etched in the life of those who delight in the Sabbath, who find rest not just from work, but in Christ Himself. It is stamped upon those who refuse to compromise when pressured to conform. It is placed on the faithful who recognize that heaven's authority outranks earth's decrees. So when you think of the Sabbath, do not see it as merely a sign hanging above the door. See it as heaven's seal pressed upon your heart, a seal that cannot be broken by trials, temptations, or persecution, a seal that will stand when the final test comes. The Sabbath is not just about what day you worship. It is about whose authority you recognize, whose voice you obey, and whose image you reflect. When you honor the Sabbath as God's seal, you are declaring to heaven and to earth, I am His and He is mine. The Sabbath begins with preparation, not panic. The way you enter the Sabbath often determines how much of its blessing you actually experience. Assess. Too many people stumble into Friday evening exhausted, stressed, unprepared, and then wonder why the Sabbath feels heavy instead of holy. Ellen White pointed to a vital truth that many ignore. The Sabbath does not begin when the sun sets. It begins with preparation before the sun sets. God gave us a preparation day, not to make life harder, but to make the Sabbath richer. The sixth day of the week is not just about finishing errands. It is about aligning heart, home, and spirit to welcome heaven's rest. If you wait until the last minute to prepare, the Sabbath will feel rushed. But if you take time to prepare, the Sabbath will feel like stepping into a sanctuary, not stumbling into chaos. Preparation is not only practical, it is spiritual. Think about the children of Israel gathering manna in the wilderness. On the sixth day, they were told to gather twice as much so that they would have enough for the Sabbath without worry. God wanted them to learn that Sabbath is not a day of scrambling, but a day of trusting. The same principle still applies today. Too often, families stay up late Friday night, cleaning, cooking, and ironing at the last second, only to enter the Sabbath drained instead of refreshed. This was never God's design. The preparation day is a gift, a chance to lay aside distractions so the heart can be still and ready for communion with Him. Ellen White said that the way we prepare for the Sabbath reveals how much we value it. If we treat it lightly, we reveal where our priorities lie. But if we prepare with care, it shows that the Sabbath holds a sacred place in our lives. Just as you would prepare for a royal guest by cleaning your home and setting your table, how much more should we prepare for the entrance of the King of the universe into our time? The Sabbath is not casual. It is covenant. It is not a routine. It is a relationship. Preparation is the love language of those who value the presence of God. But preparation is not only external, it is also internal. The house may be spotless, the meals prepared, and the clothes ready. Yet if the heart is restless, bitter, or distracted, the Sabbath cannot bring its full blessing. The most important preparation is prayer, confession, and surrender. To step into the Sabbath without laying your burdens at Jesus' feet is like setting the table, but forgetting the food. The Sabbath is not just about ceasing from labor. It is about entering into His rest. That requires spiritual preparation, time in the Word, reconciliation with others, and a heart tuned to gratitude. The tragedy is that many approach Sabbath with panic instead of peace. They rush, they scramble, they fight with their families on the way to church, and then they wonder why Sabbath feels empty. But when preparation is done in advance, the Sabbath becomes a delight. Instead of dragging into it weary and unready, you walk into it expectant and refreshed. Instead of panic, there is peace. Instead of exhaustion, there is joy. The Sabbath is God's weekly appointment with His people, and preparation ensures that we show up ready. Imagine going to a wedding without dressing, without bringing a gift, without preparing your heart to celebrate. You would miss the meaning of the occasion. The Sabbath is a holy wedding in time, a covenant between God and His people. Preparation is how we show respect for the bridegroom. Ellen White called Friday the day of preparation, and she often reminded families to make it cheerful, not stressful, so that children would associate Sabbath with joy, not dread. This simple yet powerful principle is what transforms Sabbath from ritual to rejoicing. The difference between a burdened Sabbath and a blessed Sabbath is often the preparation that leads into it. So ask yourself, do you run into Sabbath at the last minute, or do you walk into it ready to receive heaven's gift. The Sabbath is not meant to be a day of panic, but a day of peace. And peace cannot be rushed. It must be prepared for. When you honor the preparation day, you are not just organizing your home, you are preparing your heart. And when the Sabbath arrives, it will not feel like an interruption. It will feel like an invitation into the very rest of God. The Sabbath is a mission, not just a meeting. For many people, the Sabbath has been reduced to a routine. Wake up, dress up, go to church, sit through the service, and then go home. But that was never God's design for this holy day. The Sabbath is not just about attending a meeting. It is about entering a mission. Ellen White made it clear that the Sabbath was intended not only for worship in the sanctuary, but also for service in the world. It is a day to be refreshed in God's presence, and then to pour that blessing into the lives of others. When we limit Sabbath to the walls of a church building, we cut short its true purpose. The Sabbath is about lifting burdens, spreading light, and carrying hope to those who need it most. Look at Jesus. Every time the Sabbath is mentioned in the Gospels, he is doing more than attending synagogue. Yes, he read the scriptures. Yes, he taught. But he also healed the sick, comforted the broken, restored the outcast, and set captives free. The Pharisees were furious because they had turned the Sabbath into a list of restrictions, while Jesus turned it into a fountain of compassion. His actions preached a louder sermon than any pulpit message. The Sabbath is a mission field. To heal on the Sabbath was not breaking it, it was fulfilling it. For the Sabbath was always meant to reflect the heart of God, and the heart of God is love. Ellen White often urged believers to make the Sabbath a time for missionary labor. She said it was the best day to visit the sick, encourage the discouraged, and share the word with neighbors. Imagine the impact if every Sabbath keeper saw the day not just as a time to gather, but as a time to give. Too many finish Sabbath thinking only of the sermon they heard, instead of the service they gave. But the Sabbath was meant to multiply blessings outward. God pours into us so that we can pour into others. The Sabbath also carries with it a witness to the world. When you minister to others on this holy day, you are testifying that your God is not a God of mere ritual, but a God of compassion and power. Feeding the hungry, visiting the lonely, praying with a neighbor, or even sharing a meal with someone in need on Sabbath becomes a sermon without words. Ellen White reminded us that such acts do more to demonstrate the beauty of Sabbath truth than any argument or debate. People may resist doctrine, but they cannot deny love in action. Yet sadly, many treat Sabbath as if it begins and ends with the church. They guard the hours, but fail to guard the mission. They sit through programs, but do not seek opportunities to touch lives. The truth is, the Sabbath is not fully kept until it is shared. To hoard its blessings is to miss its calling. God did not sanctify the seventh day merely for rest, but also for restoration, and he calls his people to be co-workers with him in that restoration. This also transforms the way we see family and community on Sabbath. It is not simply about gathering with our own, but about extending the circle to include those who are left out, welcoming guests, inviting strangers, making the lonely feel like family. This is Sabbath mission. In doing so, we reflect the heart of God, who longs for all to come into his rest. If the Sabbath is truly a memorial of creation and redemption, then each Sabbath is an opportunity to bring a little bit of Eden and a little bit of Calvary into someone's life. It is a time to remind others that God still creates beauty out of chaos and still redeems broken lives. That mission cannot be confined to a pew or a pulpit. It must flow into streets, homes, hospitals, and neighborhoods. The Sabbath is not just a meeting to attend. It is a mission to fulfill. When you embrace that truth, the day comes alive with purpose. It becomes more than rest for yourself. It becomes restoration for others. That is the Sabbath Jesus kept, The Sabbath, Ellen White championed, and the Sabbath God still calls his people to live out today. It is not passive worship, but active love, not a ritual, but a revolution, not just a holy day, but a holy mission. The Sabbath connects earth to Eden. The Sabbath is more than a day of rest at the end of a long week. It is a bridge that connects earth back to Eden. Before sin, before sorrow, before pain, God sanctified the seventh day as a reminder of his perfect creation and his intimate fellowship with humanity. Adam and Eve did not keep the Sabbath as a burden or a command forced upon them. They received it as a gift. In Eden, the Sabbath was a celebration of life, beauty, and communion with the Creator. Every seventh day since, God invites us to step back into that same rhythm, even in a fallen world. Ellen White often described the Sabbath as a taste of Eden restored, a time when heaven comes close to earth, and the human soul is refreshed with divine presence. When you keep the Sabbath, you are not just obeying a command, you are entering a memory. You are remembering what was lost and what will be restored. The world around us may be filled with corruption, chaos, and confusion, but on Sabbath, God gives us a window into the world as it was meant to be. That is why true Sabbath keeping is so transformative. It shifts our focus away from the brokenness of this earth and reminds us that we were created for more. Every seventh day, God whispers, "This is not your home. Eden will return. My rest will be your eternal reality." Ellen White wrote that the Sabbath is both a memorial of creation and a sign of redemption. At creation, God rested because everything was very good. At redemption, Christ rested in the tomb on the Sabbath, completing the work of salvation. Both point us back to Eden and forward to restoration. In this way, the Sabbath becomes the golden thread that ties the beginning to the end, reminding us that what was lost in the first garden will be regained in the new earth. When you honor the Sabbath, you are rehearsing for eternity. You are practicing life in the presence of God, preparing for the day when there will be no more sin, no more death, no more sorrow, only endless fellowship with the Creator. Too often, Sabbath is treated as a duty, a checklist, or a restriction. But when you see it as Eden restored, it becomes a joy, a delight, a weekly homecoming. Think about how different our Sabbaths would be if we approached them not as an obligation, but as a reunion with the Creator, who walked in the garden with humanity. The peace, the beauty, the joy of Eden, that is what God longs for you to experience every Sabbath. This also transforms how we treat the Sabbath in our homes and families. If it is a taste of Eden, then it should be filled with joy, love, and beauty. Sabbath meals should be special. Sabbath worship should be heartfelt. And Sabbath fellowship should be marked by kindness and unity. It should be the happiest day of the week for our children, not a day of boredom or gloom. Ellen White warned that when children learn to dread Sabbath, they learn to miss its true purpose. But when they experience it as joy, they catch a glimpse of Eden and long for the eternal home God is preparing. The Sabbath also challenges the modern world's obsession with speed, productivity, and endless work. In Eden, Adam and Eve did not keep the Sabbath because they were tired. They kept it because they were whole. In keeping it today, we declare that our identity is not found in what we do, but in whose we are. We are not machines built for endless labor. We are children of God created for communion. Every Sabbath, we protest against the tyranny of time, against the slavery of busyness, and we return to Eden's freedom. One day soon, Eden will be fully restored. The book of Revelation speaks of a new heaven and a new earth, where the redeemed will gather from one Sabbath to another to worship before God. Every week now is a rehearsal for that eternal joy. When you welcome the Sabbath, you are not just marking the end of the week. You are stepping into a promise, a preview of eternity. The Sabbath is God's reminder that though paradise was lost, it will not be lost forever. Eden is coming back, and every seventh day, heaven gives us a taste of it in advance.